Okay, hello and good evening, everybody. Today I'm speaking to Noam Chomsky, and the topic of today is the Iranian threat. Um, the topic of today is the Iranian threat. Okay. Um, so let's say we have seen renewed provocations between Iran and Israel recently, with U.S. Ambassador Knight saying that saying explicitly that Israel can and should do whatever they need to deal with. And in contradiction to this, we have seen Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, explicitly saying that Iran is not resuming a nuclear weapons program. What do you make of the situation?
First of all, I don't think it's a very sharp contradiction. The United States has never had any serious concern about Iranian nuclear weapons programs. Suppose Iran had a nuclear weapon. Would it threaten anyone? They can't possibly use it. If they started to load a missile with a nuclear weapon, Iran would be vaporized. So they're not going to use a weapon even if they have it. If they had a weapon, it would be for deterrence. And that's a threat to the United States and Israel. These are two states that want to be able to rampage freely in the region without interference. So any deterrence is, of course, intolerable, just as any independence is intolerable. Why is the U.S. Torturing Cuba? Is it afraid that Cuba is going to attack? It's independent. Can't have that. I mean, the global system is kind of like the mafia. The Godfather doesn't accept independence. I mean, if some small storekeeper doesn't pay his protection money, the Godfather isn't afraid that he's going to take over. It's just you can't tolerate that. You can't have a system in which you can have what the State Department calls successful defiance. That's the State Department reason back in the 60s for the harsh attack against Cuba. It's Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine, which declared the U.S. right to rule the hemisphere, mafia. So Iran is doing the same in the Middle East. The United States has never had much concern for nuclear weapons proliferation. Under the Shah, for example, he was openly developing nuclear weapons. U.S. was supporting him all the way. In fact, it was kind of funny for me. I was at MIT, and the government was trying to press the MIT basically to turn uh, the basic the nuclear programs, turn them over to the Shah. They said, of course, for peaceful use, but everybody knew it was for developing nuclear weapons. And there was huge protest among the students, but faculty supported it and went through. Saddam Hussein, as late as 1990, right before the invasion of Kuwait, George Bush, the president, was inviting Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. I mean, nuclear weapons are okay if you're on our side. Uh, Israel's the obvious case, but Iran is simply an intolerable threat. It throws its weight around in the region, supports Hezbollah, supports Hamas, things that the United States doesn't like. It's uh, it's a rotten regime, but that's of no concern. The U.S. supports much worse regimes. Uh, but so basically, going back to your question, I don't think it's a really sharp contradiction. whether Iran is developing a deterrent nuclear program or not, it's intolerable to the U.S. as long as it's independent and engaged in successful defiance. Actually, the comments by the U.S. ambassador Nidus were pretty extreme. That's beyond anything that any U.S. official has previously said. The United States has never said, at least openly, to Israel, maybe tacitly or privately, but they've never said before, do what you like and we'll support you. That's pretty far reaching. Israel doubtless has plans to expand its terrorist operations in Iran. And remember that Israel is engaged directly in terrorist attacks against Iran, killing Iranian nuclear engineers, sabotage, blowing things up. I mean, if Iran was doing that, we'd blow them away. But Israel's allowed to do it because it's a client state. And they're probably trying to move on, but I'm no military expert, so I don't want to claim expertise I don't
Right.
have. But from what I understand, Israel cannot carry out far reaching, significant attacks on Iranian installations without uh, the kinds of deep penetration bombs that only the United States has, and also without refueling ability, which apparently only the United States has. So if they proceed on, it would certainly be with some form of U.S. participation. And they might do it. They're out of control. You can see by what's going. I mean, Netanyahu right now is doing just about anything he can to keep from going to jail. It's a large part of what he's doing. If he has to destroy the country to keep from going to jail, he'll probably do it. Uh, and of course the people he's put in charge of the occupied territories and security. I mean, you don't find many people like that in the world, even in the craziest states.
Who is this crazy guy? Ben Javir, I think it is. Or Ben Gavir. There's one crazy guy. Hold on.
Ben Gvir and Smotrich. What happened with Smotrich is not trivial. It's the first time that Israel has placed the occupied territories under civil administration. It's always been under military administration. That's to maintain the pretext that the territories are not occupied territories. Remember that Israel stands alone in the world. Even the U.S. doesn't agree. Israel's alone in the world in claiming that there's no occupation, just temporary administration. That's crucial because that means that the Geneva Conventions don't apply. And again, the Israeli Supreme Court, which is now highly lauded, actually has a horrifying record in justifying the illegal settlements, in violating international law, maintaining the pretense that there's no occupation. But going back to Smotrich, when he was placed in uh, effective control of the occupied territories, that's transferring it from military to civilian control, which makes it harder to maintain the pretense that it's not an occupation. Israel, of course, will do it anyway, but outsiders will have a harder time justifying it. And of
What?
course, it means more brutal, violent activity, opens up settler attacks with the IDF, the Israeli army, either just observing or directly participating, as is happening in the Hawara pogroms right now.
Um, Just to pivot back to Iran, but thank you for that. What do you make of the uh, sorry, it's a what is this? What do you make of the current media reports that Iran has achieved the 84% enrichment and yet another IE investigation that is currently underway?
Well, I would discount the media reports because that's just what they're getting from the government. But how can we know? I mean, I don't know what level of enrichment they've enriched or why they're doing it or what the purpose is. There's no indicate. You quoted William Burns right above. As far as U.S. intelligence is concerned, they're not developing a nuclear weapon. But as I mentioned, I don't think that's the real issue. If they did have a nuclear weapon, it would just be a further means of deterrence, which is intolerable to the two states that want to rampage without impediment in the region. Can't have a deterrent.
There's even a fatwa by the supreme leader that forbids chemical weapons on the grounds that Saddam Hussein used the latter in the war against the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war. Do you think that is significant?
Well, Gareth Porter on your show had interesting things to say about this, and he has a book which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but he does quite careful work. Uh, yes, there was a fatwa. As far as we know, Khamenei has maintained the same position. Whether that guides Iranian policy, I don't think we're in a position to know. It's very possibly it does, but these are questions that go beyond our capacity to have any reasoned opinion.
There are a few voices in the nuclear field that have raised similar concerns in the past, as was described by Gareth Porter in his book. In this book, The Manufactured Crisis, Porter I spoke to. Why aren't they being a why aren't they being heard?
They aren't being heard for the exact same reason that other voices aren't heard, which violate the doctrinal orthodoxy. I mean, the United States is a very free country, but also deeply indoctrinated. There's a rigid party line. You don't depart from it. I mean, there's sometimes pretty comical examples of this. So take the lead article in the New York Times today. Lead article in the New York Times saying there's U.S. intelligence has new information that maybe Ukrainian divers blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Yeah, very likely. Uh, I mean, the entire world has just taken for granted. They don't, in the South, they don't even talk about it. It's obvious that the United States blew it up. Nobody else has the capability or the motivation. But the doctrine is you don't talk about U.S. culpability. That's something that's an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. So for a long time, the argument was Russia blew it up. It's about the least likely possibility. What conceivable reason would Russia have to blow up their major capital investment and one they're counting on for interactions with Germany? I mean, it's just madness. If they want to stop the flow of oil, they can turn a valve. They don't have to blow up their major installation. Then the party line changed slightly. The article I was writing about this, articles were appearing say, well, now there seems to be some question about whether Russia really blew it up. So it's known as the thief technique by lawyers. If you're a defense attorney and your client has his hand in somebody's pocket, don't deny that there's a robbery. You'll be refuted. Point somewhere else and say, thief. Maybe people start running off in the other direction. Well, now the propaganda line is, well, there's some question about whether the Russians did it, but the presupposition is that's the only possibility. The obvious candidate is ruled out by definition, so we can't talk about it. Now, today, it's Ukrainian divers who, of course, have the capacity to carry out this sophisticated operation. But then tomorrow it'll be some other story. But whatever, I mean, it takes something as simple as look, we're reaching 20 years since the U.S. invaded Iraq. It's 20 years. Here's a simple question. See if you can find one sentence. I'm not asking for a lot. One sentence anywhere near the mainstream discourse that says the U.S. carried out an act of aggression in Iraq, the supreme international crime. It's a textbook example, straight out of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Just find one sentence that goes beyond saying, well, mistake, strategic blunder. We wanted to save the Iraqis from oppression, didn't work so well. We didn't plan it properly. I mean, I don't read everything, but I have literally not found one sentence that breaks with orthodoxy on such a perfectly trivially obvious point. You can actually say the same thing about Vietnam. It's now 50 years since the U.S. faked signature on the termination agreement, having no intention to pursue it. Try to find a sentence saying the U.S. invaded and practically destroyed South Vietnam. The whole thing is reframed as defense of South Vietnam against aggression. We failed. I think that's about 100%, all the way over to the left. Fact of the matter is the U.S. invaded, virtually destroyed the peasant society of South Vietnam. Everything else was ancillary to that. Try to say it. You just can't be heard. Those aren't words. It's not part of the English language.
That's the hypocrisy that many people in Africa and the Middle East point to, that we are supposed to condemn Russia's unprovoked war of aggression, but for some reason the US's wars in Iraq, Yemen, etc. is exempt from that criticism.
Well, that phrase, unprovoked invasion, is a very interesting one. You can do a Google search. I've done it, but try it. It's never been used in the past. Nobody ever talked about unprovoked invasions before. It started with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Everybody has to refer to it as the unprovoked invasion. And the reason is they all know that it was highly provoked. So there you have to refer to it as the unprovoked invasion. Projection, it's called in the psychiatric literature. We know it was provoked, obviously, massive provocation. There's no real question about that. It's not justification, it's just a fact. And since we know it, we have to deny it. Thief, turn somewhere else. Then take a look at unprovoked U.S. invasion of Iraq. Nothing. Maybe somebody wrote a letter to the editor or something. But there's hundreds of thousands of hits for unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, as I said, just about everyone has to say that. That's real discipline. Totalitarian states have a hard time duplicating that.
It's obvious to everyone who isn't living in the West that the US was involved in the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. I mean, what do you make of the role of the global South in highlighting this?
The global South is the region, it has its own problems. It's not that they're marvelous, but it's the one area of the world that is not entirely subordinated to the US propaganda system. So European intellectuals pretty much follow the US line, not so much the population, but the intellectual world usually is very loyal to US propaganda. The US intellectuals are just totally in service to the propaganda machine. There are exceptions. People who, McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, former Harvard dean, people he called wild men in the wings. It's people like me, wild men in the wings who go beyond saying the US made an understandable mistake and go on to treat the United States as if it was an ordinary country and analyze it but in rational terms. Those are wild men in the wings. We got to exclude them, either just ignore them totally or demonize and vilify them. It works pretty well. Uh, it's I think it works better than in totalitarian states. Totalitarian states, the propaganda is obvious, so obvious that people don't even believe it. Uh, but in free democratic societies, it's a much more sophisticated system. You you pretend you offer a pretense of free and open discussion, and there is within the framework of the propaganda system. Within that framework, let's encourage free, lively discussion, debate, and so on. And that shows how open and free we are, but all within the propaganda system. There's some beautiful examples of this. Take Samantha Power, now considered a leading figure in uh, the struggle for human rights and freedom. How did she get her fame? She invented a great literary genre. Let's harshly criticize the United States for failing to deal with the crimes of others. It's perfect. We're showing how courageous we are by criticizing the United States, and we're fortifying the propaganda system by emphasizing the crimes of others. In fact, there's things like this right now. I don't know if you followed the flap about Harvard and Kenneth Roth, head of Human Rights Watch, was an
No.
interesting case. Harvard University blocked the appointment of Kenneth Roth, head of Harvard the Human Rights Watch, for an advisory position at the School for the Carr Institute for Human Rights. So there was a huge protest. How can you do this? And of course they backed down under protest. But in order to show how wonderful he was, Kenneth Roth, they brought this is in the Nation, incidentally. I'm not referring to this is the left wing journal. They brought up the fact that there was a debate at Harvard in which it was about whether the Iraq War was a case of humanitarian intervention. That was the debate. And Kenneth Roth was so courageous and honorable that he took the negative position. I mean, it's hard to imagine what world we're living in. Suppose there was
That's
a debate,
absurd.
and this is taken seriously.
Yeah. But in free societies, it's also mostly censorship by omission.
Exactly. What you do is set the terms of discussion and have a lively debate and controversy within them. But it's the terms of the framework that establishes the propaganda system. I mean, if there were a debate in Moscow University about whether the Ukraine invasion is humanitarian intervention, we'd collapse in ridicule. But when it's in the United States, we consider it very serious. It's a very effective system.
I agree. Just to pivot back the conversation to Iran, what do you make of the relevance of the Israeli strategy to try and keep the Iran threat at high alert and the willingness of American establishment to go along with Israel unconditionally? I mean, how should Iranians react to this?
Well, when you refer to Iranians, if you mean the Iranian government, I don't have any advice to them except disappear. If you're referring to the Iranian population, it's quite a different story. They have their own internal problems to free themselves somehow from the harsh clerical control with regard to the Israeli American threats. They should, of course, oppose them. They would be a total disaster, but there's nothing much they can do about it. They're under pretty tight control. They have internal battles to struggle. I mean, if the US and Israel do attack Iran, could be pretty serious. The Iranian government, now that's what I'm talking about, has already made it clear, apparently explicitly, to Saudi Arabia and the UAE that if there's a direct attack on them, they'll respond by destroying the main centers of global oil production, which are right nearby. They're in northeast Saudi Arabia, easily within missile range of Iran. And Iran has already shown earlier that if it wants to, can attack Saudi oil production. It did it a year or so ago. A signal, don't go too far. Well, the northeast Saudi Arabian oil production system is the main one in the world. If Iran wants to do serious damage to it, it's within range. How's the US going to react to that? Well, we're often running into a major war, which could have all kinds of repercussions.
You were supportive of the last protest in Iran following the death of Masa Amini by the morality police. Yet, as with all these protests, there's always a possibility of outside forces exploiting the situation. Do you see the risk that it can degenerate into an excuse for regime change?
The US, outside forces are going to exploit anything they can. Certainly the US will, which has overwhelming power and interest. So that's a given. On the other hand, if there were to be regime change, depending on what the new regime was, I wouldn't oppose it. It's a terrible regime. But it's something that you certainly have to be concerned about. Obviously, the United States will be meddling, just as in the Maidan uprising in 2014. Of course, the United States will be there, has a primary interest in undermining the Iranian regime. So you don't want to undermine it and reinstall a U.S. run regime. After all, that's happened. We don't have to make it up. 1953, the U.S. intervened and destroyed the parliamentary regime in Iran, the last free parliamentary regime they've had. The U.S. Carried out a coup, installed a brutal tyrant who ruled Iran with horrible repression and violence until 1979. You don't want to redo that period.
You have spoken out in favor of establishing a nuclear free zone in the Middle East. How realistic is this prospect, given that it would undermine Israel's position of nuclear ambiguity that goes back all the days to all the way to David Ben-Gurion?
Well, the position of nuclear ambiguity is, of course, a farce. And the only reason anybody even talks about it, instead of just laughing, is because it's supported by the Godfather. The Godfather of the United States says, yeah, we don't know whether Israel has nuclear weapons, right? Like we don't know whether we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, or we don't know whether we invaded Iraq, and so on and so forth. So since the Godfather says it, obedient intellectuals repeat it. Other than that, of course, it's a ridiculous joke. Everybody knows that Israel has a huge nuclear capacity, also chemical and biological warfare capacities, apparently. So, why does the US insist on this? Well, for several reasons. One reason is that if the United States government, that is, conceded what everyone knows, and it, of course, knows, then American law comes into operation. There are serious questions about whether U.S. aid to Israel is legal under U.S. law if Israel is developing nuclear weapons outside the framework of the international agreements. Neither political party in the United States wants to open that door, and obedient intellectuals don't raise the question either. But it's a very serious question. I mean, people like me talk about it, but we're effectively silenced. Uh, what about the feasibility of a nuclear weapon free zone? Completely feasible. Everyone in the world is in favor of it. Arab states have been calling for it for decades, strongly. That's what they want. They're worried about Israel. Iran is in favor of it. The Global South, of course, is in favor of it openly. G77, very vocal about it. Europe, not raising any objections. Every time it comes up in an international forum, US vetoes it. Obama was the last one in a major forum. Why? Well, all kind of pretexts, but the reason's obvious to everyone. You have to protect Israel's nuclear weapons facilities. It's kind of interesting how exquisite the propaganda system is. So, a couple of months ago, there was a New York Times editorial, first mention of a nuclear weapons free zone in the Persian Gulf. Let's establish a nuclear weapons free zone in the Persian Gulf. The editors are not imbeciles. They know perfectly well that everybody in the world is calling for it in the Middle East. But thief, let's point somewhere else. It's an astonishing system. If anybody really had any concern with an Iranian nuclear threat, the first thing they would call for is a nuclear weapons free zone that eliminates the threat. No negotiations, no JCPOA, no joint agreement. You have inspections. Inspections work very well. We saw that during the JCPOA. So you eliminate the threat totally. That tells you how serious the concern is about the Iranian nuclear threat. Obvious, simple solution. No threats, no violence, no nothing. Can't do it because it would threaten U.S. aid to Israel. And that overwhelms everything else. And of course, you can't say that, though anybody with a gray cell functioning knows it.
Would those laws regarding aid to Israel actually be enforced, given the
That's an
Israeli
interesting question.
relationship?
So up until quite recently, it was literally unmentionable in polite circles. It's beginning to change. There's been a change, significant change in U.S. public opinion, not government. not intellectual world. But in general, U.S. public opinion has been a substantial shift in attitudes towards Israel. It used to be that Israel was the darling of liberal Democrats, liberal intellectuals, adored it. Harder and harder to maintain that as Israel moves farther and farther to the right, as the atrocities become harder to suppress. Liberal opinion has drifted away from support for Israel. Even among the intellectual class, take a journal like the New York Review of Books, the leading journal of liberal intellectuals. Up until pretty recently, Israel was a holy cow, couldn't touch it. Now they're writing articles, they're publishing articles critical of Israeli policies. In order to protect themselves, these articles are written by Israelis. So you can't accuse us of being anti Israel, but they're running them. They didn't before. And in general, support for Israel in the United States, even among young Jews, I should say, it's declining sharply. The support for Israel now is on the far right among evangelicals, huge evangelical community, who are in fact the most extreme anti Semites in history. Their position is we have to support Israel to lead to Armageddon, and then Christ returns and all the Jews go to eternal perdition. Can't get more anti Semitic than that. But they strongly support Israel for these reasons. It's a big voting bloc, 30% of the population. Then far right nationalists, ultra nationalists who like strong, violent states, so they like Israel. And then, of course, the military and security establishment, which is very closely integrated with Israel. Israel performs all sorts of services around the world, we should recognize. Like when the Reagan administration wanted to send military aid to Guatemala, which was massacring the civilization, the society. Congress blocked it. So they turned to Israel. Israel, of course, happily moved in, uh, armed the Guatemalan army, commit genocide against the Mayans and so on, all over the world. Uh, Colombian state terrorists, murderers, Israel's happy to support them, sometimes in ways that the United States doesn't object to, but doesn't like particularly. So Israel's the main supporter of the Myanmar military, Israeli security officials and uh, uh, export uh, uh, systems armed and controlled it, developed it, and now protected. Uh, Israel has no, I mean, South Africa as well, as you know, Israel was supporting it militarily and so on, as was the United States, Reagan.
Yeah.
Uh, so it has all kinds of services to the United States. It's a highly armed, militarily efficient, technologically advanced, very brutal society, perfect ally for the United States. But support for it in the US is drifting to the sectors of society that think, oh, that's fine, away from those who have some kind of liberal, humane concerns. And
Yeah.
that's showed up in legislation. For the first time, there have been proposals in Congress to condition U.S. aid to Israel on meeting minimal human rights standards. Betsy McCollum, a Democratic congresswoman, had legislation to that effect. Didn't get much support, but it was there. Recently, Bernie Sanders has come out in favor of it. He's a little harder to silence, has a lot of support. Anyway, it is on the agenda for the first time, and it lead to uh, could lead to, uh, if not enforcement, at least congressional support for it. Now, that would be very harmful to U.S. Israeli policy.
Egypt signed did not ratify the African Nuclear Free Zone Treaty. Shouldn't that have theoretical implications for its relationship to Israel?
Well, we should recognize that the African nuclear free zone can't go into effect because of the United States. There's the island of Diego Garcia belongs to Mauritius. It's part of Africa. The International Court of Justice, UN General Assembly, has ordered Britain to hand over Diego Garcia to Africa. Britain was told by the United States, you can't do that. And of course, Britain follows US orders slavishly. So therefore, Britain kicked out the population and refuses to turn it over to Africa and establishes a major US military base there, which under Obama was raised to nuclear facilities. And this base is not a joke. It's used for bombing Central Asia and the Middle East. So the African nuclear weapons free zone can't go into effect for this reason. It maintains nuclear weapons thanks to British servility to the United States and the US demand for nuclear weapons facilities. This is another one of those things you don't talk about.
Is there a possibility of reviving the JCPOA or achieving a détente between Iran and the rest of the world?
Well, right now it doesn't look very likely, but I think a détente is developing between Iran and much of the world. So Iran has good relations with Russia. Iran has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's the China-based program for developing Eurasia. Iran's now a member of it. Has reasonable relations with large parts of Asia. Of course, it has no relations with the United States. The United States is opposed to it. Europe's an interesting case. Europe is strongly opposed to the US sanctions, strongly. In fact, when Trump instituted the harsh sanctions, Europe said we're not going to go along with them. They openly objected to them. They're conforming to them. Europe does not step on the toes of the Godfather. They may make speeches about it, but when it comes to practical action, they'll subordinate themselves to the master. So Europe observes the sanctions angrily, but it observes them. So it's kind of interesting. This is a very interesting case. The US business community is opposed to the sanctions. Ordinarily, they're the ones who run the government. But there's a split now, an interesting split between the main economic forces in the United States who would love to get into the Iranian market. Energy corporations would love to get into it. Arms corporations, commercial sales to Iran, all in favor of it. U.S. government won't let them because the importance of preventing successful defiance overwhelms even the business world. Actually, there are a couple of interesting cases like this. Cuba is another one. In the case of Cuba, U.S. pharmaceutical industry, agricultural industry, energy industry, big parts of the economy want to get into the Cuban market. Government won't allow it. We have to block successful defiance. In fact, if you look back, this happened in Iran in 1953 in a very interesting way. The U.S. government intervened to overthrow Iranian parliamentary democracy and basically took it over, imposed the Shah. But there was the U.S. government had a condition. the U.S. energy corporations had to take 40% of the British concession. Britain had run the oil system. The U.S. oil companies had to take 40% of it. They didn't want to because they could get cheaper oil from Saudi Arabia. So, just for plain short term business reasons, they didn't want the 40%. It would undermine their better uh, efforts in Saudi Arabia. The Eisenhower administration forced them to. It threatened the oil companies with antitrust actions unless they accepted 40% of the British concession. Well, it's not a big sacrifice, but they finally did it. These are very interesting cases where the government and the economic powers that run the government are in conflict. And the very same individual, if he's an executive of an oil company or sitting in the State Department, will make different decisions. And there are reasons for it. To put it in sort of Marxist terms, the government is the executive committee of the ruling class. And sometimes the executive committee has a different view of the world, a longer term view of the world than the ruling class itself. So an oil executive says, I want to make money tomorrow. And same guy sitting in the State Department says, I want to make sure there's no successful defiance in the world. So you'll make money 50 years from now. And they make different decisions. These are very interesting aspects of the way foreign policy works. And there are among other things that you just don't talk about.
You sketch a worldview that is based on a mafia, a realist perspective. How does one get to see get the US and the EU to see that in the long term this is not in their interest to dictate to others and not move to more cooperation?
That's been a major issue since 1945. In fact, a little earlier, when the US forces invaded Italy. Is the US going to control Europe, or is Europe going to go on an independent path, be a third force in world affairs? The huge US armament programs in the early 50s were in large part designed to ensure that Europe would remain within the US orbit. There wasn't much concern about the Russian threat that was manufactured. Uh, if you look at the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe, large part of the Marshall Plan was to convert Europe and Japan, independently Japan, but to convert Europe to an oil-based economy. Europe had a coal-based economy. Europe has large reserves of coal, doesn't have any oil. So if you switch Europe to an oil-based economy, then the US has veto power over European actions. I'm quoting George Kennan, the leading policy analyst. That was smart. And it's gone all through the years. De Gaulle was famous for calling for an independent Europe. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik was a move in the same direction. The US was always able to shoot it down. Gorbachev, when the Soviet Union collapsed, became very serious. Gorbachev called for a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military alliances, no victors, no defeated, common efforts towards a social democratic future. It was anathema to the United States. The US wants the Atlanticist system run by NATO, which is, of course, run by the US. Well, Vladimir Putin gave Washington its fondest gift on a silver platter. He handed Europe over to the United States. And the US is now using that power to extend NATO to enlist Europe in its coming conflict with China. In the last NATO summit, the United States expanded NATO to the Indo Pacific region. So now the Pacific is part of the North Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean are part of the North Atlantic surrounding China. And the United States is carrying out a massive program of highly provocative program against China. Now Europe is enlisted in it, and they're going along, and they're suffering for it. Europe's declining. Europe's going into serious industrial decline. And it gets even worse if you look at the details. Part of the US war against China is to try to prevent Chinese economic development. Very open, there's nothing secret about this. Got to prevent China's economic development by blocking Chinese access to advanced technology. Well, let's go back to Europe. The Netherlands has the most sophisticated, advanced lithographic industry that produces essential parts for semiconductors. The United States is telling them, you've got to lose the Chinese market. It's a pretty serious blow to Europe. Are they going to tolerate it? The United States is ordering South Korea to do the same thing. Big blow to Samsung. In fact, even Taiwan, you take a look at the figures. Taiwan is expanding its commercial activities in China. That's its natural trading partner, investment center, and so on. They're expanding it. Japan is trying to figure out some way to get around the US demands. I mean, whether the world is going to conform to this US effort to maintain itself as the unipolar godfather of the world, it's not so simple. If you look at the current Ukraine conflict, one country is gaining from it, the rest of the world is suffering. Europe is suffering, South is suffering. Ukraine, of course, is being devastated. Russia's suffering. U.S. is gaining. U.S. fossil fuel producers, military industry, banking industry, euphoric. Profits are going through the roof. Geopolitically, Europe is back in the pocket of the United States. It's fantastic. Furthermore, this is openly said now, it's not even kept quiet. With a small fraction of the colossal US military budget, they are able to seriously degrade the military forces of their main military opponent. It's a bargain. What's not to love? Let's keep it all going.
It's insanity, basically. Just last question on nuclear power. Just to put it back, I see nuclear power has been proposed as a solution for reducing emissions and the impact of global warming. Yet even the advocates of nuclear power, which I'm often guilty of, should be aware that this is a step between civilian and military power, and it's always a possibility. Is there a way to guarantee a path that expands civilian power without the risk of proliferation, or are you skeptical?
Well, you're in a much better position to answer this question than I am. I don't really know a lot about it. I don't have the technical competence, but I'm pretty skeptical. There doesn't seem to be any way to do it. And there are other problems with nuclear power. One of them is it's far more costly than renewable energy sources. The only reason nuclear power can even be used is with massive government subsidies. Solar, wind also gets subsidies, but nowhere near that. They're just pricing out nuclear power on the market. Furthermore, the disposal of nuclear waste problem still hasn't been solved. So it's pretty serious. For a long time, Europe was dumping its atomic wastes into the oceans off Somalia, destroying the oceans, destroying the fishing grounds. It's one of the reasons why Somalis turned to piracy. We now have to attack them for piracy because Europe destroyed their capacity for survival. another small story in international affairs.
That doesn't sound logical. So,
All the problems are serious, and I think they're pretty good arguments against nuclear power, but it's basically I don't see it as a moral issue. It's a technical issue. And there you just have to look into it carefully.
I mean, for a long time, the US generated electricity from repurposed warheads. That's an example that sounds sensible, but it isn't proposed by the advocates.
I'm sorry, which one is that?
The last one I said, for a long time, the US,
Repurposed warheads?
yeah, sounds sensible.
Wonderful. I didn't know that. Everywhere you look, you find more ugliness.
I'd like to thank you for this conversation, and thank you very much.
It's good to talk to you.